my alma mater and to think of what the possibilities are for this alignment. I was telling them at lunch, F.W. Borum says you can either look at something or you can look through something. If you look at a child, you will not see very much except that child. But if you look through the child, you can look at a life that is to be lived, the impact that can be made, and all that God invests in that one little life. You can look at a telescope and you can see the mechanics of it. You can look through a telescope and see the heavens. And I just pray that through this alignment, we can look into the future and how young men and women could be affected for the proclamation of the gospel and in defense and confirmation of that gospel. So I'm honored to be here at its inception, and we will do our part. This is a great seminary. It's a great institution, one of the finest in the world. Those of you who are studying here realize that. I was here during the days of Gleason Archer and Walt Kaiser and Thomas McComiskey, at the same time that we had John Gerstner and Norm Geisler and John Warwick Montgomery, studied under the great privilege under Dr. John Woodbridge. I remember Norm Geisler once saying to me, I had you here for 2 years, but you never opened your mouth even once. Why? I said, I was afraid you'd know I knew absolutely nothing. I'd come in absolutely green. And how this faculty shaped my burdens, my thinking. And, you cannot gainsay that. You cannot repay that kind of debt. And if there's a small role I can play in just coming alongside whatever doors we can open and they can open for us, along with our Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, which is now an accredited institution through Wycliffe Hall, Oxford, I can see this incredible tandem relationship of exchanging faculties and giving the students to study on both sides of the waters, understanding worldviews. Let me just take 10, 12 minutes to say something and then leave it open for questions. We had a great session here this morning, and this is an informal one for some of you to raise your questions. And it is this. When you look back upon the landscape of, say, the last 25 years or 30 years, there were voices sounding forth at that time of the changes that were coming. I remember listening to Everett Koop and Francis Schaeffer in the 1980s, sounding the alarm of what were being then seen as the moral underpinnings from which extensions would be made and decisions would be made. Who would have ever thought that you'd hear ethical theories that we now listen to from the voice of Peter Singer and others, not just liberal in their thinking, but radically so, at the end of a spectrum of thought where we not only do not know how to define human life, but we define it in ways that could actually be stunning and shocking. And once the shock value is gone, they become common ideas and carried into ramifications. We no longer can define what life is. We cannot define what sexuality is. We do not know how to define what marriage means. I remember when Chuck Colson had invited me and a few others to New York some months ago, from which emerged the Manhattan Declaration. I remember at the end of that day phoning my wife, and I said to her, I was in New York flying back to Atlanta that night, I said, I never dreamed of the day that you'll have a room full of men and women trying to define things like life, marriage, sexuality. Things that you thought would be self-evident or that would have some input of the sacred, now thoroughly desacralized and almost defying any kind of definition or any kind of parameters. But people like Schaeffer warned us of this. I remember reading Malcolm Muggeridge in the 1970s, and Muggeridge himself had been quite a robust hedonist in his days. And yet when he handed in his papers as the chaplain of Edinburgh University, he made a powerful statement when he handed in his resignation. He said, whatever else the future holds, it is not going to lie in sexual freedom and psychedelic fancies, said he. And so from my point of view, he said the death knell is being sounded right now. This from a man who had lived an indulgent life and later in his life came to find Christ and tell the university students that it was a wrong-headed direction in which the academy was actually moving. Now, voices like that were there. And now as we live in the high noon of that kind of celebrated reasoning, It is going to be up to you and to me to know how to respond, why to respond, where to respond, and to do so not merely for the winning of an argument, but for the communication of something greater, brighter, nobler, that has that enchantment of what life was intended to be like and may well be like. And that's why we are part of an institution such as this, to understand the times. I have just written down, for the lack of time, just 5 changes that I think have come in the last 25 to 30 years. The first is the popularization of the death of God, of the atheistic mindset. Now, we all see that visibly. But the second part of this is a very important comment. It is not just the popularization of the death of God that we have seen, but the willingness to live with its ramifications. Once upon a time, you could argue with a person and take them to the logical outworking and say, how would you like to be in this kind of a world? Now the mindset seems to be, if you say it and repeat it, and say it in a triumphalistic note, that's all you need to do. Who would have ever thought that an entertainer on a night program could actually humor his way through the indelicacies of his own private life? Whatever else it ought to have done, it ought not to have been something to trivialize and make a joke out of. But that's it. You say it, you pronounce it, you celebrate it, and it's over. Can you imagine if I, as a preacher, were to admit to all those kinds of prevarications and then make a joke out of it and move on? I shudder to think of what would happen if the pulpit could do that. But they say hypocrisy is the charge that vice brings to virtue. The charge of hypocrisy is what vice brings to virtue. That deep in their own thinking, they know some things are wrong. At least hypocrisy is wrong. And it is wrong for those who preach noble truths and preach great ideas of what life is all about. And so I say to you that the popularization of the death of God, but the celebration of its ramifications, so a la Hitchens and Dawkins and Dennett and Harris, they will just say cavalierly what in 1946 Huxley said almost covertly: I want this world not to have meaning because a meaningless world frees me to my own exploits of sexual and political freedom. So that was one line thrown into a big book. Now it is a case of the main course that is being said again and again. You and I have to respond to that kind of thinking. Number 2, it is the third world's attack upon Western ideas with the pantheistic and postmodern underpinnings to it that has actually made the ideas that shaped the West look juvenile and everything else that comes from abroad look very sophisticated. It's the way it has happened. Now, I have a question for people like that. Why did you come to the West? Why did you move in that direction? Because there were some moral assumptions that were the bequest of the Judeo-Christian framework. Even if you didn't want to give credit to the worldview that framed them, you liked what you saw in the outworking. Do you know the Chinese government has just commissioned scholars in China to write again the history of missions in China, because the leadership in China recognized that missions have not been given a good and a fair name? It was a professor from one of the leading universities who sat in my office some weeks ago and told my wife and me that they are commissioning this writing to give the due benefit of what missions had done over the last century, principally in 2 arenas, in education and health, well-being for the Chinese people. This is being recognized and offered up now, money being offered up there for research. If I look at my own country like India, you look at a man like Deepak Chopra, who will tell you in his writings that he went to a Christian school and studied there. I went to a Western school in Delhi, and the gift of health and care and education came from the Judeo-Christian worldview. It was William Carey, along with Rajaram Mohan Roy, who fought to abolish the sati system, where the widow had to throw herself into the flames of the husband's funeral pyre because her life was considered of no value. Carey fought for the protection of the woman in that, and Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a great Indian leader, came alongside him. One of the leading newspapers in India is called The Statesman. That was founded by William Carey in order to give the Indians a voice in the days of the British. These things are gobbled up in history, and people don't even take note or remember that. Think of this statement. We take these truths to be self-evident, that we are all created equal, with inalienable rights for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let me ask you this question. Do you know of any other religious worldview that would have framed that statement other than the Judeo-Christian faith? Could naturalism have framed that statement? No. Nietzsche said equality is a lie concocted by the weaker of the human species. Because he said there is no such thing as equality. There are superior, there are inferior people. And that was the idea that Hitler ultimately took to bring triumph of one group over the other. But the Christian faith so clearly says we're all created equal. And that gift of liberty is ultimately the gift of God, not something just bequested by a state or culture or whatever. But now all of a sudden, you can be in any public talk show, and it seems as though the most unwanted voice is that of the Christian. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I did an open forum at Hong Kong University a few weeks ago, and a young Western gal stood up and said, I don't understand why you think there is such a difference at all. She said, I've read the Quran and I've read the Bible. They're both saying the same thing. It's in a public forum. We must understand what these worldviews are saying, and with respect, draw the distinction, draw the clarity of the gospel. There are ideas in the gospel that are not present anywhere else. Take, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, profound piece of writing of the Hindu scriptures, much more popular than the Vedas. And in that, Krishna calls for the Prajapati, the sacrifice. The words of Krishna, they're calling for the sacrifice, but there's no sacrifice offered in there. Calling for forgiveness, but there's no forgiveness in the reincarnational system, is there? You pay and you pay and you pay and you pay. And how gently the gospel can be presented. I have a friend sitting here who comes from a Hindu background. He's a businessman in Atlanta. For nearly 1 year, weekend after weekend, we chatted and chatted and chatted. And finally, when it dawned on him on the beauty of the gospel, in our living room, he bowed his head and prayed. Until this very day, the most glorious thing he'll talk about is about the cross and what forgiveness really means. It's a beautiful truth. And yet the world out there doesn't realize how precious it is. When you've gone wrong, you look for forgiveness. How marvelous to know the cross has provided it. But this disorienting hit from pantheistic worldviews. Number 3 is the power to inform through the visual. We now take truth through the eye gate, not through reason. And so it comes through the back door of the imagination. Where I think it was William Blake who said, this life's dim windows of the soul distorts the heavens from pole to pole and goads you to believe a lie when you see with and not through the eye. We are intended to see through the eye with the conscience. Most people today see with the eye devoid of a conscience. This life's dim windows of the soul distorts the heavens from pole to pole and goads you to believe a lie when you see with and not through the eye. So we've got a visually conditioned culture. I'm not much of a moviegoer, but people plead and beg me to see some of them so that we can respond to them. So I was cajoled and pled with and written from different parts of the world to please go and see Avatar. I wanted to say we already had 330 million of them. Why one more? But I did. Brilliant, isn't it? Brilliant in cinematography. And now English movies are just beginning to resemble Hindi movies. That's all it is. The melodrama of it. That's all. Bollywood was 30 years ahead of this kind of stuff. And 30 years ago, we'd sit and laugh at it. Now it is so engaging, Isn't it interesting? A Hollywood technocrat who sees the military as the culprit for destroying lives has never bothered to ask how many souls and consciences Hollywood has destroyed. Think about it. How many lives has it destroyed with its means? Oh, but you can't go there. The well-known actor William Hurt had breakfast with me one morning in Thailand, and he's no lover of the Christian faith or whatever, quite a secular-minded man, but really we had a very personal chat. He said to me, he produced a film. He was en route to Hong Kong, and Hollywood had rejected it in one line. They could not accept it because there was no violence in it. I said, are you summarizing what they said? Extrapolate? He said, no, that's the one line. They don't want it because there's no violence in it. I wonder if he told the producer of Avatar that. They didn't want it because there's no violence in it. That's what entertains. It's all coming through here, and we don't bother to think this through. And we've got a generation raised with the visual that has never cerebrally addressed these issues of systemic contradiction. And lastly, I say this, it has become a youth-oriented world as a cultural molding point, which means the young ought to really be an audience to whom we speak and how we speak to them. The question is this: how do you reach a generation that thinks with its eyes, or listens with its eyes and thinks with its feelings? How do you reach a generation that listens with its eyes and thinks with its feelings? That's the challenge. I give you just 3 simple responses, and then we'll take questions. Number 1, we are going to need an apologetic that is not merely heard, but is also seen. The apologetic will have to be seen. If the Christian life is not seen, it'll become nothing more than theoretical. Just 4 days ago in Washington, a young Indian woman, very successful, of a young family, a mother of 2, I think, immensely successful, came to me up to the front and said, "Can I talk to you?" And I was surrounded by people, so I couldn't. But as I said, I'll call you on my way to the airport. And literally, while my colleague is taking my bags, I get on the phone and she phones me, a very well-to-do family. And I had the privilege of seeing her come to Christ right on the phone as I'm walking to the gate. And you know what she said to me? She said, "The reason I'm talking to you is because in some of the greatest struggles our family has had, it has been the Christians who've been there to help me and help me find my way through these dark nights of the soul," as you called it. What a tribute to the Christians who have sown the seed and done all of the groundwork, and then I have the privilege of just praying. And you didn't even have to pluck the fruit, you just had to keep your hand there. It was ready to fall into the hand. And so the life has to be lived. And when the life is lived, never underestimate the impact of what it is going to do. Seen, not just heard. Number 2, an apologetic that is not merely argued, but that is also felt. You cannot have a persuasive preacher if the preacher himself or herself is not coming through as being persuaded. That internal engagement of the emotion, that internal engagement of your personality, woe be to me if I preach not the gospel. That passion that is so real. It is fascinating to me when I go to the Middle East how intensely passionate the people are. They expend more energy in saying good morning than you and I would oftentimes in a whole message. The passions are very real, and therefore the passion for the gospel will also have to be real if it is to appeal to a generation that lives so much with its feelings and so much with the pathos and so much with the reality of the felt word. So I say it is to be heard. It is not merely to be heard but seen, not merely argued but also to be felt. And lastly, it is an approach that rescues not only the ends of bringing them to the knowledge of Christ, but the means where we do not compromise the word in process. It's a very important point. You cannot compromise the word in the process of bringing them over to the experience of Christ. It is very easy to do that and very difficult not to do it. That means, how do you reach a world where that which is seen and that which is real is identical? You will have to bring that life in the proclamation of the word, where what is read and heard is identical to what is with life itself. The Bible doesn't say in the beginning was video. It says in the beginning was the word. In the beginning was the word. I have often thought, why didn't Christ wait to be incarnated till we had the video camera? It would make so much sense. The Sermon on the Mount and Lazarus. If you had all the video cameras showing all that stuff, my goodness. But when the rich man finds himself asking God why he could not go back to tell his brothers, God said to him, they already have Moses and the prophets. And if they do not believe Moses and the prophets, they will not believe even if somebody comes back from the dead. The word has a lasting, abiding value as a carrier of truth. It has an abiding, lasting value as a carrier of truth. I don't know how many times I've been on a mission where I've been terrified to go in front of the audience, and one verse leaps out at you and brings the lion out inside of you. It is not just a memory, not just a picture, but that word. Your word have I hid in my heart, that I might not sin against you. And it is that word that cannot be broken. And it is that word that is held in high esteem here. There are many theological institutions where the word is not honored. Religion is, ideas are, but the word is relegated to something archaic and passé. And yet it is the word that Christ has given to you and to me. And from that, I make this extension. I remember some time ago telling people, I was speaking at a bar association, and many years had gone by about this story. And I was at the North Carolina Bar Association, and the head of the bar association, she was sitting next to me and said, "You must be a very brave man." I said, "Why?" She said, "You've come to people who deal with words. They're able to argue themselves out of any situation." I said, "So you're telling me I should be nervous?" She said, "Well, this is a tough audience." I said, I understand, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to, but I'll do my best." And they sat there after lunch. It was this kind of a look, And I began by saying, I said, before I came here, something fascinating happened. I said the first 3 items on the news on CNN were this. Number one, this was during the days where a famous statement was made, it all depends on what the word is means. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. And so, as we do in this culture, in a salvation by survey culture by which we live, you want to find answers to anything, survey people. So the news cameraman was walking around, and the first question on his survey was, do words mean anything? Do words mean anything? Or does the speaker reserve the right to fuse every word or any word with their own meaning? And after the survey, the answer was, no, words don't actually have an objective meaning. It is the speaker that fuses meaning into the words, and that's what words really are. We speak and we decide what meaning fits into them, so that was the answer. The second question was, does morality have any point of reference? And the answer was no, each person chooses their own morality. So words had no referent. Morality had no referent. You know what the third item on the news was? I said, ladies and gentlemen, the third item on the news was a warning sent to Saddam Hussein that we'll start bombing him if he doesn't stop playing his word games. The arms just dropped. I said, so if you are a peddler of words, and your words don't have objective meaning and objective value, you are manufacturing a world of your own. And when worlds collide of that nature, the impact is of cataclysmic proportions. Wasn't it Thomas Becket, the man for all seasons, when he is told to renounce his words or whatever, trying to see if I can get this story here straight. And not Thomas Becket. Who am I thinking of? Thomas More. Good for you. Thomas More. Actually, you know what? It's one of my relatives that wrote the book. He lives in Cambridge now. An Englishman, married to one of my distant cousins. In India, we're all related. And so we just lay credit to whatever we can. So he's in prison, and his daughter comes to him and says, "Why don't you just say the words? Say the words in favor of the king and you'll be released." And he says, "Meg, no." He says, "When you give your word to somebody, you hold your life in your hands." And he said, "If you should open that hand and drop your word, you shall look down and you shall never find yourself again." When you give your word to somebody, you hold your life in your hands. If you open your hands and let it drop, you shall look down and never find yourself again. Your word and my word to society will have to be consistent with what we preach. And the word that he has given to us is what we must carry within our proclamation, because that word is truth, and that word cannot be broken. So it must be seen, not just heard, must be felt, not just argued, must rescue not only the ends, but the means as well, so that the word is preserved and protected. So I leave that with you for openers here, and if there are any tough questions, my colleague John Jaroge will answer. All the easier ones I'll be glad to take. Thanks so much for giving me your attention. Yeah.
I think that we all are probably glad we came at this point in time, but we not only have the privilege of sitting under Ravi's teaching, we have the privilege of actually interacting with him. So if you have written down a question on a card, I'm going to ask you to pass it into the aisles actually right now, and we're going to begin to collect those. And so please go ahead and do that. Also up here is John Jaroge, Talbot graduate and an associate apologist with RZIM. Can we welcome John also? Welcome. You know, Ravi, that was fascinating. One of the points that you made here in the last moment was one I'd like to kind of start our Q&A with. Apologetics has changed tremendously over the past maybe 30, 40 years. There was a classical style of apologetics that has given way, in some degree, to a more cultural style of apologetics. There are some who have concerns over a new social gospel in the midst of a community impact. How would you set the stage for us as church leaders to understand and integrate ourselves into the proper stream of apologetics going forward in the next 30 years?
Yeah, I think, Scott, yes, you're right. The classical approach has held sway and still has great value. Mm-hmm. It is important to understand how apologetics has come across in history, how the great apologists taught. And if you read, even going back to E.J. Carnell and his varieties of Christian apologetics, and go through the proliferation of the subject in the 60s and 70s. By the way, when I was here, William Lane Craig and I were classmates. We lived in the same apartment building. We fellowshipped around the garbage dump every night and talked about some of the issues of the day. And Craig is much more the classical apologist. I think Francis Schaeffer and Os Guinness provided the bridge for a good culturally relevant apologetic. And Oz is still quite active in that, understanding the sociology of knowledge and all of that, how people think the way they think and why they think the way they think. So I believe that in cultural engagement, it is important to have the classical arguments because, you know, we stand on the shoulders of those people, because sometimes a question will come where the classical part of it is the introduction to your answer, that it diffuses the question. But then you have to get to the felt answer, the felt reality. And that's where an understanding of culture, one of the great struggles in India and the Middle East, and even a country like Russia or China, if we don't understand the wounds of that culture, we'll never be able to communicate to them. Every culture has its wounds. Many of them are wounded civilizations. Russia, you look at the Polish people today, in how they are mourning the loss of their whole government. You know, it just wiped them out. And Poland has lived with such pain across their history. And if an apologetic does not understand their pain, does not understand the anguish of the soul, you will always speak from a mountaintop to which they can never reach. You cannot connect. Understanding the hurts of a people, understanding the needs of a people, understanding the whys of the question of the people, I think is a very key to how you answer it. If you are giving an answer cerebrally, but you don't realize the woman you're talking to is just talking about a thoroughly deformed baby that has just been born to her, you will be talking completely outside the realm of her need at that time. So you have to connect felt need with classical understanding of reality. That's where the argument and the story and the demeanor has a great effect on how the listener is going to hear your answer. And John, I know you've done a lot of work in some of these plays. What are your thoughts on that?
Maybe what I can add to that is sometimes we tend to value what we do more than anything else that anyone else does. So that if I'm very good at argumentation and the intellectual ideas and all that, then I take that to be the most important thing that everyone else should be doing. And we forget that there are many other aspects of being human that also need to be addressed. And especially for leaders in the church, if you are a very, very gifted communicator of the gospel, you can find it very difficult to understand why it is that some people with a very questioning mind would still be essentially remain unchanged, as Ravi was talking about this gentleman in there who had a very good example from his pastor and from his wife, but still his life remained unchanged. We need to be able to approach the presentation of the gospel from a holistic perspective. And the metaphor that the Bible gives us of the body and the different gifts being used, we need to see that in practice in the community, in the church, so that we can be able to address every area of our existence as human beings, and we don't just swing from one end of the pendulum to another and just emphasize one thing, because all these different gifts come into play in forming the body of Christ.
I'll add another footnote to that, to Scott. The change in apologetics today is that people, because they've heard some arguments, think they understand those arguments. And so the moment you even start that approach, it is put aside. That's why I think we should be using a lot more arguments from poetry, from music, from that kind of entrance into the heart that the person can connect with. And I found oftentimes if you quote from some musician or some piece of poetry, my work at Cambridge was in the Romantic poets. And when you see people like what Samuel Taylor Coleridge and others wrote, and you quote poetry, the audience literally perks up. It is an era of thinking in what I call the various intimations of reality, and they have to be approached at certain points.
That's very well said. That actually leads into someone's question pretty well. This is a question. Christians are comfortable talking about truth because of the belief that there is an objective truth. I'm going to have to summarize this. Is there such a thing as objective beauty? And if there is, how does it serve as an apologetic?
I think there is such a thing as an objective beauty within a hierarchy of preferences. Let me explain what I mean. You can tell when beauty is violated much more than you can tell, well, something beautiful is just beautiful per se. Because when the Bible tells you to worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness, in other words, beauty cannot be unholy, beauty cannot be profane, beauty cannot be desacralized. So in the continuum of beauty that can come within holiness, there will be options, there will be preferences, colors may vary, choices of aesthetics may vary. But if profanity comes into it, then at that point you have violated what beauty must intrinsically have. So I think it is wrong to say that beauty is purely a subjective thing. There is an objective point at which ugliness is revealed if it is profane. That would be my answer to that.
That's a good answer. Yeah. John, how about you?
I remember reading recently. I still haven't seen Avatar. We don't have many of those in Africa, so I probably need to see the movie. But I remember reading somewhere that there were some people who went to see that movie and they committed suicide afterwards because of how beautiful apparently it is, and that it's impossible to find that kind of beauty in this world. And part of what we are to do as those who are called to preach Christ is to present the beauty, a vision of beauty before people, the beauty of the gospel, the beauty of God and the fullness therein, so that people can truly long for God, because he is the ultimate standard of beauty. And we know for example, when music is dedicated to Christ, like Handel's Messiah or some of the paintings that still change people's lives, is because of the work that has gone into those kinds of works that bring out the best in who God is and what he has put in us. And so this is another area, the arts, which has been neglected. Today we are not producing a lot of Handel's Messiahs today, and I think we need to be able to do that in our churches. So part of it.
That's very well said. One of the things that strikes me as well is, thank you. One of the things that strikes me as well in the midst of this is potentially some of the beauty that people may be searching for might be the beauty of love, particularly love of God and love between one another. What RZIM does so well is to come in and open doors, open minds, and open hearts. But in that openness, God must find a place to dwell. And that's the role of the church.
You're absolutely right.
Would you just speak to that and apologize?
Absolutely right. I think most young people that I talk to have given up on love. They don't believe any such thing actually exists. I remember when I was writing one of my books, I told this story. I was in Singapore, and I was talking to one of the waitresses, and she asked, when I told her, she saw my wedding ring and asked me how long I'd been married, and it was 2-3 years ago. So I said it was 30-some years and so on. And she said, that's hard to believe. It's very hard for me to believe. And then I told her of a story I'd read in Reader's Digest of this young man in his teens who had basically lost the girl that he loved because her mother would not allow them to get married. It's a long story, and 60 years later, somebody found a wallet on the side of the road, and through that wallet, he traced the person down, but God managed to trace the person down because in that wallet was the last letter he'd received from the girl, that when she was only in her teens, 60 years before. And the upshot of the whole story was, it was written by a man called Fine, F-I-N-E, I remember that. And the upshot of the whole story was both of these were now in their late 70s in the same retirement home on different floors. And they went up, and when they met each other, neither of them had married for the sake of the love that they once had. When I told this young waitress the story, she said, I don't believe that. She said, I don't believe such a thing really happens. They become cynical on that. And so the loss of love, the loss of true romance, the loss of commitment is great. But one of the things we can do as a secondary expression of that love, and I keep telling my team this very much, we as a team need to model that fraternal relationship, the love for each other, the respect for each other, the belongingness to each other, and not to compete with each other. If you can show a true fellowship in the gospel and true love for each other, it is a powerful apologetic in and of itself. And I think that's a very real example that needs to be followed in our time. But your point is right, Scott. I think the church needs to model that kind of love. My book is about to be released in June, Has Christianity Failed You? We interviewed people who'd left the church, and the single common line from those whom we had talked to on the streets or whatever was that when they had stumbled, they found that the church totally rejected them and no longer had any room for them. And they just walked away, not from God, but they'd walked away from the fellowship and were living lonely lives of trying to follow Christ. It's a difficult line to draw, but it's an important line that we do not end up condemning those who have struggled and faltered and want to find their way back in a body of believers where love is the supreme ethic, rightly so.
One of the concepts in our church that we talk about fairly frequently is we call practical atheism. And by that we mean the belief in God. We believe in God while behaving as if he doesn't exist. And when we look at that idea and how, when it's entrenched in our soul, creates an anemic, tepid Christianity, and ultimately frustrates much of what the Holy Spirit is trying to do in the life of the Christian, and it diminishes the witness of the church into the world, how would a cultural apologetic and a personal apologetic influence someone whose belief, potentially where they may assent to at least a good deal of what you may say, yet their heart is not engaged by those ideas? How would you say for us as Christian leaders to lean into that and to draw that person? I'm laying it all on you, John. This is it.
Well, and that's a tough one, because there's a role for the person to play, and there's also the role for the person discipling them to play. But one of the things I think that needs to be emphasized again and again is what is the goal of the scriptures in people coming to Christ. For the most part, we talk a lot about winning souls for Christ, which I'm all for. There's nothing as satisfying as praying with someone to receive Christ. But once the person has received Christ, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, given their background. Today we have a lot of young people who are growing up in a culture that is not saturated with the Word of God. In this country, maybe in the 50s, for example, there would in some neighborhoods, you had people who grew up with a Christian worldview. They went to church even if they didn't want to, and they only rejected or left the faith when they had the power to do so. So even when they were rejecting the faith, they knew what they were rejecting. But today, you're dealing with people who don't really have those concepts. And if you use some stories, for example, from the Old Testament, they will have no idea what you're talking about. So that biblical worldview, biblical thinking, and the storyline of the Bible is not given to them. And in our churches, mostly we will emphasize changing behavior in our preaching. And usually you get to the point where you begin to blur the line, because it seems like a psychologist could also do that. And so what's the difference between what we are offering in the church and what's being offered out there, probably even in a better form? So it's understanding the storyline of the scripture so that people are truly formed and they're able to meditate on the Word of God, because it really does change our thinking. And if we do that, we'll be forced to confront ideas that these people are wrestling with. We'll be forced to confront those ideas, because there's no way to address those issues without breaking down the worldview, the ideas that have held them down. You know, I've come, the more I've done this and talked to people and different people in different situations, the healthier the respect I have for the power, the spiritual power of ideas. Because when you think of what the tempter did in driving Adam and Eve out of the garden, he didn't do that through demon possession or by overpowering their will or by an illness or anything like that. He succeeded by planting an idea in their mind. If you eat of this fruit, you will be like God. Because then he knew that if they could buy that idea, then he had them. He could take a vacation, because they would be doing his bidding without any physical restraints. And so we need to be able to form the mind of the people in our churches with the Word of God, so they are really thinking and looking at the world right, like Christians. And maybe in the presence of many pastors, maybe I shouldn't put it this way, but in many churches you will not find that taking place today. And I finish this, one of the frustrating things that I've gone through is a friend of mine who was very educated. He had a couple of PhDs, a very gifted mathematician and scientist, and he had a lot of questions. And he got to the point where he said, we had discussions back and forth for a long time, and he said to me, I want to go to church with you and hear what they say there. And then when we would leave the church, he had a lot of questions. He would say, the pastor agreed with me. He was into the New Age movement. And I would say, no, he didn't mean that. He meant this. But the messages were not presented at his level. And it's difficult to find an activity going on, and that's why some of the messages that Ravi puts out have been so effective, because they are reaching people where they are. I was also headed to medicine when my life was turned around. I ended up in apologetics through Ravi's ministry.
Excellent.
Appreciate that, John. Kind words. Two things to that I could add, Scott. A lot of it sometimes has to do with where they have come from. If a person comes from a radically different religious worldview into Christ, they seem to have clearer lines of demarcation as to what they believed and now they do. If there has just been a smooth move from nothing into Christ, sometimes it is very hard to have a clear line of distinction. The second thing, I can only speak from my own experience on this, because we all can stumble into that mindset of living as if God is on the periphery rather than as the center of your life. And it is this. I think it is a tumultuous time in which we live, with the invasion of the mind from every different direction. I can't handle it some days. You know, you're watching the news, you've got your BlackBerry, you've got about 150 emails at the end of the day. It is almost to a point where God doesn't have a chance to break through into those moments where you need to hear from Him. And if you don't order your life, other people will order it without intending to. There has to be, and if we do anything, we do go into groups, or we've got studies with groups and so on, that time of being alone with God is very critical. And I would strongly encourage anybody who wants to have a close walk with God that you have to order that in your disciplined private world. These BlackBerries buzz at 5, 6 in the morning, and before you know it, you can't even talk to God because somebody else is talking to you and you're responding to all these things. So it's a difficult time in which to live a consistent godly life. And the only thing, when I write my books, I walk closest with God, because I shut off my telephones and my BlackBerries. There's only one group of people who can reach me, and that's my family. I have a private number for them. But to everything else, I'm shut off. And I actually come back rejuvenated and energized. And I would encourage, if that is a struggle, to find a pattern where God has His input first before anything else has its output for you. Yeah. I
think that's excellent. There have been several questions that I have been receiving here that have to do in some way, shape, or form with politics. I'm going to attempt to distill that, I think, down a bit and just maybe say, not just from an apologetic perspective, but from a Christian wisdom perspective. As we look at the direction of the current administration, as we look at key issues of healthcare, poverty, the poor, immigration, Christians are obviously very divided on these issues. And there are different perspectives on each of them that we may be coming from. As you look at the landscape generally, what would be some guidance that you might give us to specifically inform our perspective as we are communicating Christ to maybe a broad congregation that has different views and hold them as Christian? That's a tough question.
It's very, very tough.
I made it a lot easier than what was here, just so you know.
And it's tough because no matter what you say, somebody's not going to like it. Yep. That's the issue. So let me speak in generalities. And I think about it. You think about it. I wish I had the answers. I think I have the answer for myself in the way I want to walk in this and the way I want to choose in this. Joe Gibbs, who is with NASCAR, he used to be in the NFL. And I wrote a chapter for one of his books, and I spent half a day with him in his NASCAR office in the Carolinas. And I said to Joe, how did you find to make the change from the NFL into, running at such high speeds in the cars and all of that? He said, because one thing remains common between the two, it is the depravity of men. He said they were as depraved in the NFL as they are as depraved in NASCAR. He said, and I see the depravity. Somewhere the government assumes that all of the bad guys are in the public sector and they are okay, that we can trust the government to make right judgments for us, and that the corporate world has all of the nasty guys in it. When you have, my father was in government. My dad was in the home ministry. He was as straight as a toothpick in his moral preferences. And I remember my older brother, Ajit, the day we took off from Delhi, he was 22 and I was 20. That's the first time we'd sat on a plane. Took off for London, and then we were going to go to New York, and New York to Canada, where we were going to make our home. My brother was very cynical and very far in his thinking. As the plane lifted off, he looked at me and said, "I'm never coming back here. Never coming back here." I said, "How come?" He said, "The government is so corrupt," he said. "You never get anywhere except for who you know rather than what you know." He'd struggled to find a job after college, and he'd become so bitter and so cynical. Well, welcome to the world here as well. It has become identically out here. You watched the political games going on in this, that I think left you very demoralized at the end of it. And you see the same kind of corruption here systemically as you see it everywhere else. What I think I talked to Stuart McAllister from Scotland, and I come from India, and here's our experience for what it's worth. When the central power is given to a governing authority to deal with so many areas of your life, in the end there's a kind of a demagoguery and an autocracy that'll go on, that'll plunder the soul of a people. And you look at what happened to state religion in Europe, it's because the state took charge of it, religion got corrupted, and the churches are now empty because they became cynical in the process. The process of freedom and letting the market work and letting humanity do its thing with government supervision in some way, I think minimizes the evil. It'll never eliminate it. Churchill said democracy is the worst form of government except for all other forms of government. And what I see happening is when too much of power is vested in one authority, you live with the danger of abuse of power. And so systemically, I think we're headed in the wrong direction. That's the way I see it. The particulars we may debate about. I'm talking about the philosophy that's driving it that is troubling to me. Yeah.
I think that's an excellent answer. Here, we'll go down a more biblical route at this point. Can you discuss or respond to the apparent cruelty of God in the Old Testament?
Yes.
I didn't say they were going to get easier. I said they were going to get more biblical.
I'll tell you what. You may think there's a humor in this, but there's really not. It's very serious. This has been an area that John has really been working on, and he knows that we have had a great deal of trust in the way he's responding to these questions and writing on the subject. And John, I think you should really take this. Now, the problem is you can have a long answer, you can have a short answer. We'll have to keep it short, and I'll be glad to add a footnote to that if you want. Yeah.
We actually have a resource. If you email us, we can send a CD out that deals with that gives the long answer to it. But basically, the approach that I usually take in responding to this question.
Can you hear him at the back? Are you able to hear him? Does he need to raise his voice a little? Can you hear him? You can hear him.
Can you hear me?
He needs to raise your voice. Yeah.
All right. Well, this question has become really, really important today, especially with the publication of Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, because he bases most of what he says in that book on attacking the character of God. How can you worship a God who allowed genocide and those other and the other evil and suffering that the Jews inflicted on the Canaanites? How can we reconcile that with the meek and mild Jesus in the New Testament? And usually I go through this in several steps, and what I will say, first of all, even before responding to the question, is that the question itself assumes a certain a moral standard. You have to assume that there is such a thing as good and evil in order to raise the question. Because if there's no moral standard, then nobody did anything wrong. There's no point raising that question. But you can't have a moral standard without God. because if you're dealing with a moral law, you're dealing with you have to appeal to a moral lawgiver. And so this question, if there is an answer to it, it has to be found within the very nature of God. It's the goodness of God that gives rise to this question, and it's only within a biblical perspective that the question even makes sense. And then the next thing is, this is actually a version of the problem of evil. Why would a good God allow pain and suffering and all that, allow evil to exist? In this case, it's being asked with regard to God's character himself. How can he do this if he is good? But again, when the question of evil is raised, it usually goes something like this: if God is all good and all powerful, evil would not exist. Since evil exists, there cannot be a God who is all good and all powerful. But that ignores the fact that God is also all-knowing, and he may actually have reasons for allowing certain kinds of evil that we are not privy to. And so in the same way that we respond to the problem of evil, we can also, given what else we know about the character of God, be able to say that, be confident in saying that what we know about God may, within his nature, have reasons for which he allowed those events to take place in the Old Testament. So that's just even before responding to the question. But in terms of responding to the question itself, you can look at the way that those events in the Bible took place, because most of the times they are really exaggerated. God is presented in the worst light possible. But if you look at, for example, Genesis 15, what you see is 400 years before those events took place, God speaking with Abraham, and he says to him, your descendants will be enslaved in Egypt, and then I will bring them back to this land. And then this is the phrase that is relevant to what I'm saying right now. Because the sin of the Amorites has not reached its full measure. This is 400 years before the events took place. So whatever you want to say as an atheist about what took place in the Old Testament, we cannot say that what God was doing was a knee-jerk reaction. It was not, because it was planned long time ago, and God gave these people this whole time to change their ways, and yet during this whole time he was also allowing his children to languish in captivity for those 400 years while he waited for the Amorites to take place. And so by the time the Jews got to the promised land, the time was ripe for God's judgment to fall upon these nations. And if you read, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 9, what you find is that God repeats himself over and over again in that chapter, the first 6 verses of Deuteronomy chapter 9, saying that it is not because of your righteousness that I'm sending you to take this land, because you are stiff-necked people. And that's repeated over and over again. Israel was just an instrument in God's hand. God could have done that directly, but he chose to use Israel as an instrument in his hand. And then when you look at what happened to Israel itself, they were also subjected to God's judgment. Sometimes we think it's only the Israelites who inflicted punishment on those other nations, but they themselves were not victims of their own evil against God. But they were. All you have to do is look at the book of Lamentations, for example, and see what Israel went through. And then you come to the New Testament, and you find that the distinction between an angry God in the Old Testament and a meek and mild Jesus in the New Testament is actually fiction, because in the New Testament, you have Jesus talking about hell, people being banished from God forever. Then the book of Revelation is full of images of what will happen when God's judgment falls again on the nations. And so God's character is consistent in both the Old and the New Testament. And then
can I interrupt you at one point? Yeah. Can I shift the question on you a little bit? I think that's an excellent classical answer.
Yeah.
I think more true to the question here would even be a person's experience reading the actual acts and the mind behind them in the Old Testament, and trying to have it be consistent with a God that would be compassionate toward them personally. For instance, if God had that degree of wrath and is even contemplating, in some cases, a more genocidal approach as a solution to a problem, how can I then, even like that God, want to be like that God or have confidence that that God will be benevolent toward me when I need them to be? I think that's more the case in point.
Yeah, it's based on what else we know about the character of God. These incidents, the incidences, when the way they are given to us, they span over thousands of years. So it's not something that God did within just one period and wiped everybody out. So these are events that took place over that long periods of time, and we just get glimpses of what God did in the process. So how can we be confident about the nature of God and that we can be able to trust him in spite of what he allowed there? The reason we can do that is because that's not all we are given, even in the Old Testament, about the nature of God. We know a lot more about what God is like. And we can look at people in the Old Testament who related to God, who was supposedly a monster according to Dawkins. But if you look at people, I'll give you an example. Exodus chapter 33. God makes an incredible offer to Moses. He says to Moses, take these people to the promised land. The land will still be flowing with milk and honey. I'll have angels fighting for you, but I'm not going to go with you because you are stiff-necked people. That would be a jackpot, because you have all of God's blessings with angels fighting for you and without God telling you what to do with it. But Moses says in verse 15 of Exodus 33, he says, if your presence doesn't go with us, do not send us from here. So the people who knew God and related to him came up with incredible devotion to him, with Job saying, though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. David being given the choice whether to be punished by God or by his enemies, and he chooses to be punished by God because he says God is more merciful. And then Jonah not wanting to go to Nineveh because he knew that God is gracious and forgiving and all that, and slow to anger. So when we look at the whole picture, rather than zeroing in on those acts of judgment, we can know the character of God and then know who we are trusting. We can do the same thing with the New Testament. You can just pick the passages that talk about hell and that God himself will inflict on people and say, I cannot worship a God like that. But then you have ignored everything else that the scriptures have to offer.
Let me add 3 footnotes, and we are to be in the car in 2 or 3 minutes here. Let me say 3 things on this, and then we'll close. When you look at the cataclysmic nature and the dramatic nature of God's judgments in the Old Testament particularly, don't forget they're always juxtaposed with the dramatic form of revelation that he has also given of himself. Those are often ignored. For example, if God were to say, descend through the ceiling and rent it in 2 and come out and say, if you walk out of here and blaspheme my name, you will bring havoc and destruction upon a whole society. And this dramatic nature of his revelation is in keeping with what he has threatened or promised.